Thank you, Betsy, for that gracious introduction. And thank you, Norma Clifford, for inviting me. It is good to be here this morning, and I'm glad to be with you. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to share an hour with me and to hear a little bit about the work that I'm doing. And if you will, indulge me just for a moment in terms of the change of topic. We're going to advance one book in the canon from Genesis to Exodus, and about 2,500 years in history to the 19th century, where Exodus was the most popular text for sermons in the United States. So today, I'd like to do two things. So first, we're still going to talk about creation to some extent. I realize that creation was on your on the schedule, but we're going to talk about creation, if you will, creation of an interpretive tradition. In fact, creation of an interpretive tradition that has been most neglected in U.S. biblical interpretation, and that is African American biblical interpretation. And I specifically want to talk about its uses of the book of Exodus. So, if you haven't guessed, I will be speaking about a bit of the work from my recent book, The Politics of Exodus, in biblical interpretation. But before we get there, before we can talk about the politics of biblical interpretation, or the politics of Exodus, there's a thorny issue that I think we have to wrestle with first. And that thorny issue is this concept of biblical authority. Biblical authority. That is, for me, how the Bible speaks. The idea that the Bible speaks. And you may say, well, that sounds odd. The Bible doesn't really speak, does it? But we claim it does with metaphorical language, right? When we ask, what does the Bible say about marriage, or how I'm supposed to love my wife, or what I'm supposed to do with my money? Now, while we may not be clear about the Bible speaking, what I am clear about is that we, in fact, speak for it. And so, for most of my career, I have been interested in how texts come to mean, how they come to mean something and then mean something different to someone else. For example, how does the Constitution mean one thing to strict constructionists, these guys, except for Kennedy, he may be somewhere in the middle, or means something very different to broad constructionists, like these justices. Or in my field, how in general the interpretation of the same passages differ from a red state to a blue state, sometimes a red congregation and a blue congregation within the same state, and sometimes right across the street. And we can probably name a few examples here in Nashville. In other words, text means something only within a particular field of interpretation. So when I talk about an interpretive field, that takes up a person's prior experiences. Like, how do I think about the ways that I've been formed in my life? It takes up a person's social and political orientations. Really important in terms of how we read text. What our communities have interpreted for us, and what our beliefs are. So let's take up three examples. First one, I'm sure it's one of your favorites. And my computer doesn't like me right now. Let's see here. Do we have sound?
Our government is no longer willing to defend our borders. Thousands of illegal immigrants are pouring across the southern borders, knowing that once they get here, they will not be deported. While that's against the law, it's the truth. More than 54,000 unaccountable children. I'm going to talk about children now. 54,000 unaccompanied children have been processed so far this year. ABC News reports that there are 300,000 unaccompanied children in America awaiting deportation hearings, a process that takes from 3 to 5 years with an attorney you pay for. Criminals are now using this crisis to flood across the borders. Rapists, murderers, pedophiles, drug pushers, terrorists are being treated like royalty at your expense. Hello, Congress. Hello, Congress. This is your fault, and it's shameful. Shame on you. You caused it.
All right. Or take this example. That was John Hagee. John Hagee, the millionaire pastor of Cornerstone Church in San Antonio, Texas, one of the largest and more popular conservative churches in the United States. And that was 2 years ago. I am trying to see here.
Was he teaching that in church?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. All right, and or take, for example, this one. We'll only listen for a couple of seconds so we can.
36 times in the Old Testament. This one's going to be tough for you if you think that we should just send everybody back to Mexico. 36 times the Old Testament, nation of Israel. America isn't the nation of Israel, but just the same. 36 times it says, don't mistreat the aliens. I think we need to camp on this one for a minute. 36 times people who came into the land that was promised to Abraham in the covenant, he said, don't mistreat them.
And finally, you look at this one. This one takes a minute to get to, but
you need a website. Why not do it yourself? With Wix, you can create your own professional website.
Generally, last night, Barack Obama used incredibly secular language to pitch his immigration reform plan to the country, but he did delve into biblical language at one point. Let's run that clip.
Scripture tells us that we shall not oppress a stranger, for we know the heart of a stranger. We were strangers once too. My fellow Americans, we are and always will be a nation of immigrants. We were strangers once too. And whether our forebears were strangers who crossed the Atlantic, or the Pacific, or the Rio Grande, we are here only because this country welcomed them in and taught them that to be an American is about something more than what we look like, or what our last names are, or how we worship.
Now, the right wing very often attacks.
all right, so 3 examples, or take this example. Who's right? Southern planters in the 1860s? Southern preachers defending slavery asked, who could question the word of God when it said, slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling? In Ephesians 6:5. Or, tell slaves to be submissive to their masters and give satisfaction in every respect, in Titus chapter 2, verse 9. And at the same time, simultaneously within abolitionist circles, abolitionists would turn to passages such as Galatians 5:1 in order to refute the pro-slavery position. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery. For each one, their position is always true because The Bible says so. So how do we get to this place where the Bible speaks to us? Who's right? What I've come to understand is that whether it's John Hagee in the first video, or Todd Friel in the second, Barack Obama, or the Southern planters, or abolitionists, that they are all doing the same thing. That they are wielding biblical authority toward their own ends. So let's interrogate this idea of biblical authority. How do we arrive at this? This idea that the Bible says. You know, evangelical Christians who take up the Bible as authoritative are familiar with this verse. All Scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness. Anybody familiar with that? Yes. The text is often used as the Holy Grail in evidence, as a Holy Grail in terms of the evidence for biblical authority. When I say biblical authority, I mean seemingly in and of itself, the ways that the Bible wields power in our world. So I'm often asked, well, what does the Bible say about some of the most mundane things and some of the things that have the most dire consequences in our lives, such as marriage or divorce or slavery or war or something like getting tattoos or poverty? And I'm always tempted to respond in a smug way, well, whatever you say it says. But then I remember my commitments to my faith and the fact that I am ordained, and I restrain myself. And I also remember that, in fact, there are several books dedicated to just that. What does the Bible say? Here's the ultimate answer book by Brian Ladolfi. There's even one for kids. What does the Bible? It has cartoon pictures all throughout. Homosexuality, sexuality in general is always a big one. There are a lot of books like this. And then if you don't have a lot of time, if you want it simple, there's even one for you. What does the Bible say about easy to understand answers to the tough questions? This tells me two things. First, that we have given the Bible iconic power over us. Iconic power. This is what I mean by that. My seminary professor would say, the Bible means book, but we took the Bible and we decided to make it holy, as in the Holy Bible. That's iconic power. Its presence presides over us at our weddings, at our funerals. Its presence ensures the veracity of our testimony in courts of law. It sends us to war. It inaugurates our presidents. It presides over our baptisms and even our executions. And in many southern states, its presence has prevented us from opening liquor stores on Sunday afternoons. But the second, and that's iconic power, but the second and the more troubling issue is that the Bible also understands itself to have discursive agency. In other words, biblical authority depends on discursive agency. And by discursive agency, I'm referring to the idea that the Bible takes language and deploys it to a particular desired end, an intent, the way that a person might when she speaks. The Bible has a certain discursive agency in that regard. But herein lies the problem. Think about authority for a minute. Authority is legitimated power vested in some agent. So, for example, when we see a child abandoned on the side of the road, what do? We say call the proper what? Authorities, right. Authorities are people. These are people who've been legitimated by our society to perform a particular function, to do what we have authorized them to do. For example, or the police, or in the case of the example I mentioned, the Department of Family and Children's Services, right? Or the department in Tennessee, I think it's the Department of Children's Services. So, but because authorities are people, are agents, agents have to have the power to abuse such authority. Authority has to be able to be abused for it to be authority. Take, for example, what the authorities did in Ferguson, Missouri. But what would it mean to give authority to something that has no human agency? Like an inanimate object, like a chair, or desk, or even a book. How did we get here? So, briefly, let's go back to a time before the Bible had authority. Believe it or not, we can do that. Before Martin Luther, authority had nothing to do with the Bible. It was the property of the Roman government. The Catholic Church soon adopted the symbols and the language of Roman power and vested them in the magisterium. And that's the body that comprises the Pope and the bishops, all who construct authentic law and authentic teaching for the church. See the similarities? In the Christian tradition, authority in its earliest form was not located in the Bible. In fact, a concept of biblical authority would have been strange to the earliest Christians. Authority resided in the magisterium. That is the Christian counterpart to the Roman Imperium. Within the magisterium, the question was always about right interpretation, never biblical authority. In fact, wrong interpretation was not considered a violation of biblical authority, it was considered a violation of the church. The point is that what we later call biblical authority resides not in the Bible, but in the church. In fact, St. Augustine would say, "Indeed, I should not have believed the gospel if the authority of the Catholic Church had not moved me." For centuries, the church determined what the Bible meant until Luther comes along, frustrated by what he saw were abuses of their authority, and then he claimed that the Bible itself was its own authority outside of the church. But what does it mean to impute authority to the inanimate? Martin Luther comes along and you might say authority sort of goes awry. At least by the end of his life, he thought it did. His pronouncement, sola scriptura, shifts the locus of power from the magisterium to nowhere, to everywhere. By nowhere, I mean what could authority mean for a book without someone to take responsibility for its interpretation, or someone who possesses the legitimation in a community to interpret it? And by everywhere, I mean that without the magisterium, anyone could, and anyone did, claim the authority to wield the Bible. What Luther had done was not uncover the Bible's authority and render it visible. He simply took the legitimacy of the church and diffused it. And so fast forward to today, when everyone from Billy Graham-inspired evangelicals to Ku Klux Klan loyalists to from mainline Protestant preachers to Pentecostal believers and everyone in between, everyone claims that the Bible speaks to them. This was a part of our American identity. In fact, during the 18th century, the U.S., then a young republic, staked out its very identity between two traditions: the social, that is grounding in our founding documents, and the sacred, grounded in the Bible. I want to begin here simply to emphasize this, that we are the agents. We are legitimized by our communities, by our degrees, in ecclesial settings, by our robes, by our grand edifices, by our pulpits, by our statuses in our churches and in our communities, and we wield the Bible's iconic power. It is our discursive agency that represents the Bible as speaking. African Americans, too, participate in this larger tradition, but from a markedly different vantage point. This is where the tradition in African American biblical interpretation begins. Let me turn to, very quickly here. This is James Albert Granasar, or Ukasa Graniasa. Take a moment and let's read his account. It renders more poignantly this idea of the Bible speaking to us. He writes, he used to read prayers in public to the ship's crew every Sabbath day. When first I saw him read, I was never so surprised in my whole life as when I saw the book talk to my master, for I thought it did. As I observed him to look upon it and move his lips, I wished that it would do so to me. As soon as my master had done reading, I followed him to the place where he put the book, being mightily delighted with it. And when nobody saw me, I opened it, put my ear down close upon it, and in great hope that it would say something to me, but was very sorry and greatly disappointed when I found that it would not speak. This thought immediately presented itself to me, that everybody and everything despised me because I was black. Ukasa Graniasa listened, but the book gave him nothing. What went wrong? Graniasa was sure that he saw the book speak to the captain. Earlier that day, he and the Dutch captain stood on the same deck, but their horizons were worlds apart. They had no reference for each other's worlds. In the captain's Western cultural tradition, books, religious or otherwise, do not talk. But in African traditional religions, talismans, amulets, drums, and so forth sometimes speak. Graniasa had no reference for reading as a mode to understand a book, but Dutch captain had no reference for listening as a mode to understand a religious item. Thus, when the captain read the book in public prayer, Graniasa saw him talking to the book. Then something remarkable happened. Perhaps in the natural pauses of the captain's cadence, Graniasa saw the book respond. For Graniasa, conversation was so taken for granted, and reading aloud was so strange, that he saw the book talk. Since the book had spoken to the captain, then why not him? So as soon as he was alone, he approached the volume, lifted it to his ear, and listened, but the book gave him no response. Finally, Graniasa read the disappointing silence and spoke for the book. He knew that it, like everything else in the New World, despised him because he was black. Now, almost 50 years later, he's writing this. And he writes, upon recollection, he qualifies his experience. He says, for I thought it did. He's been converted now to a Western cultural perspective. But Graniasa retains the trope of the talking book because it mediated for him the oral tradition of his West African birth and the literary tradition of his Western captivity. For African American biblical scholars, the talking book, this trope, signifies black people's aspiration to hear the Bible speak the Word of God. New Testament scholar Alan Callahan writes that black folk en masse, young and old alike, learned to read as soon as it was legal. African Americans knew that the book was more than a symbol of the conqueror's religion and power, because they believed it was a symbol of justice that held moral authority even over their captors. That's the iconic power of the book. And because they did, they wanted the Bible, the book, to speak the Word of God to them. However, this deep desire to hear the book talk, I think, seduces us from a more frightening prospect and a less explored one. Namely, and it's in Graniasa's experience explicitly, it's namely the silent book. It too is a part of the narrative. The silent book, a book for which we speak, is the subject of my research. Callahan hints at it when he says, as a written text, it greeted African Americans in silence. When I revisit this episode, I read it this way. In fact, the Bible greeted the captain in the same manner. Graniasa did not realize it, But the Bible gave him no more and no less than it had given to the Dutch captain. So when Groniusal spoke for the book, he was doing exactly what the Dutch captain had done. Both took up the book, both interpreted its silence, and both left the encounter with meaning. Groniusal, now to be sure, each apprehended or understood the book differently. Groniusal interpreted the book's iconic power, while the captain read the book's letters. But the difference between the two encounters can't be reduced to the modes of apprehension. Even after Groniusal learned to read, and certainly wrote this very eloquent narrative, he still interpreted the book differently than the captain. In other words, he spoke differently in the book's silence. Groniusal spoke from the position of the vanquished, while the captain spoke from the position of the conqueror. In the silence, what Groniusal took for granted in a world totalized by his subjugation to white power immediately came to consciousness and to articulation. From his viewpoint, even the book of God had nothing for him. Along with everything and everyone in this new world, it despised him because he was black. Now, as subsequent generations of African Americans read the Bible for themselves, they wielded the Bible and biblical authority to resist Western culture's discursive force. And they wanted to determine their own lives. As they did, their religious imagination held transformative power. They deployed the Bible as religious discourse to reclaim black bodies as human bodies, and to also to claim that they too participated in the Imago Dei, that is, the image of God. And for African Americans, the Bible stories, particularly the Exodus story, grounded their religious knowledge. African Americans readily transferred its themes of bondage and freedom to their own context. And black religious imagination endowed Moses, Pharaoh, the Egyptians, and the children of Israel with iconic status. Such imagination summoned the Bible stories to mediate Western history and the textuality of Western history. They wanted to claim a counter-history, a history that they would write for themselves. Now, when I say mediate this textuality of Western history, there's another way that the Bible works in our society. The Bible participates in our understanding of history. In fact, particularly in the 17th and 18th century, it would not be uncommon for people to say Adam and Eve were the first persons created. And if they were the first persons created, and I'm somewhere in the 16th century, it means that I'm in that stream of history, right? It would also not be uncommon for people to say that I'm an heir of the Abrahamic covenant. It would not be uncommon for people to say that at some point there was a flood, or at some point there is a crossing of the Red Sea and a band of Israelites crossed from slavery to freedom. In other words, the Bible becomes the book through which we see ourselves and our history, and through which we see the whole world. Think about how the Puritans took up the Bible and saw themselves as the ancient Israelites, crossing over not the Red Sea, but the Atlantic, and ridding the land, the New World, of abominations in the same way that their ancient Israelite forebears did. Think about how the Native Americans got taken up in that story. They were the abominations. If that's the case, think about how Africans get taken up in that story. In a very similar way. So, what Africans attempted to do, and then later African Americans attempted to do, is to say, well, here's this book with iconic power that we see our captors using as a way of understanding themselves, and we also see our captors taking this book and wielding its authority. In fact, they claim that it is because of this book that they have legitimated their cause for freedom against British tyranny, right? So if they've done it, why can't we wield the book in the same way? So when I say mediate the textuality of Western history, they wrote a counter-history. In other words, their captors may claim that the descendants of Africa were enslaved because they were despised, like some of the figures we read about in the Bible. But Africans and their descendants in the American Republic mediated their identity with the Exodus story, and they knew a different truth. They claimed that because we were enslaved, they knew that God would deliver them. God had chosen them, and God's election would be manifestly evident when freedom came. They refused to be engrafted into the Western tradition as the conquered ones, whom the enlightened Europeans civilized. They read the Bible's stories onto themselves, and by doing so, they signified themselves into history in a different place, much in the same way that Europeans signified themselves into history. They understood themselves as Israelites crossing over and clearing out a new land, a new Canaan. African Americans did somewhat of the same thing. They read the Bibles onto themselves. So when they preached about the band of Israelites, they inscribed new meaning upon their own past, and they trafficked in the Bible's iconic and discursive power. They conferred upon themselves the standing that the Israelites possessed in the Western literary tradition. These activities constitute the politics of African American biblical interpretation. It consists of successive attempts by African American interpreters from the Antebellum period all the way on, to reclaim African American bodies, black bodies, from Euro-American discourses. When African Americans appealed to biblical authority, they sought iconic power to signify upon them. And for much of the Republic's history, the Bible was singularly suited for this form of resistance. When you think about it, through the 19th century and to some degree even through a little bit of the 20th century, most Protestants in the American Republic would claim that the Bible was the text or the transcendent text for Western history, because other histories had to be interpreted in view of the Bible. And if other histories and even sometimes other scientific texts, right, if they contradicted what the biblical tradition said, there was some controversy. So the Bible had some real power. You could use the Bible to re-signify or reinterpret yourself in Western tradition. Think about, for example, even in the 20th century, the Scopes trial, right? We still, and I'm not sure that trial has ended in popular culture. There's a creation museum just up the road, right? So, as early as the 17th century, Anglo-American settlers imagined themselves mimetically performing the Israelites' conquest. They pacified New England and rid it of so-called abominations, just as the Israelites had done in Canaan. However, African Americans identified with the story's presentation of the Israelites as an enslaved people whom God delivered, rather than as an instrument of God's military will. Eventually, their interpretations would inform the nation's self-understanding during the Civil War, when U.S. troops sang about freeing Israel from Egypt as they marched through Confederate territory. And it is in this tradition of interpretations, African Americans who did not have civil access to basic rights developed their own sacred traditions and their own civil discourses, using the same sources, the Bible and the founding documents, but with a different politics. Biblical interpreters such as Absalom Jones, David Walker, Zora Neale Hurston, Francis Ellen Watkins Harper, Adam Clayton Powell, and Martin Luther King Jr. sculpted a counter-identity for African Americans in the wider American landscape. Their interpretations were radically different and often fundamentally oppositional to those of their white counterparts. Now, it is this radical difference from each other and from their white counterparts that I find most intriguing. I mean, how do we make sense of the differences between, say, a John Hagee or Todd Friel and a President Obama all on the same subject, using the same book? How do we account for the differences between red states and blue states, or red congregations and blue congregations, interpreting the same passage on the same day with radically different meanings. I found a similar phenomenon in African American biblical interpretation, and I take them up as cloud and fire performances. I mean, does everybody remember Exodus 13? The Lord went up from them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them along the way, and a pillar of fire by night. The Exodus narrative gives us two distinct beacons, a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. Each appeared when it was most visible, the pillar of cloud by day, the fire by night. And during the day, when you think about a cloud, and I take these up as metaphors for interpretation. When you think about a cloud is subtle, it's fluid, it's kind of quiet movement, recalls a more conservative interpretation, a conservative leader whose interpretive activities sought civic reform, using measures that were already legitimated by society. But on the other hand, a raging column of fire, pressing urgently against the nightscape, is at once brilliant and an arresting spectacle. Such a symbol invokes, in my metaphor, more radical, strident voices whose interpretive work radically challenge the social and political fabric of the nation. Although the respective beacons of cloud and fire appeared in vastly different forms, they led both the children of led the children of Israel to the same place, that is the Promised Land. So, how many of you all remember reading in school Paul Laurence Dunbar? Okay, great. A few of you. He's one of the most celebrated poets of the 19th century, and he has this wonderful poem called "We Wear the Mask." And I invoke that poem because the mask is my way of understanding this cloud and the pillar of cloud and fire. Think about what a mask does. He writes, "We wear the mask that grins and lies, that hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts we smile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask." You think about a mask, in Dunbar's poem, the mask conceals the existential alienation that African Americans experience as a part of everyday life. But masking possesses a doubling, an ironic doubling. One doesn't simply hide behind a mask. I mean, it's not like a blank sheet of paper, right? The mask does more than obscure the face. The mask also publicizes something as well. In the poem, the mask obscures the wearer's cheeks and eyes. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. But simultaneously, the mask enunciates something else. It grins, it lies. Its enunciation calls attention to the mask itself. So when you think of a Halloween mask, if you're wearing a Donald Trump mask for Halloween, certainly part of what the mask does is it hides your face, but it announces something else. Donald Trump, right? So the mask does two things. Its enunciation calls attention to the mask itself, and the enunciation is its deception. The deception is that you're Donald Trump. At least I hope that's the deception. The pillar of cloud performances entail this doubling. It conceals and advertises. Metaphorically, the grin and smile advertise a certain contentment with the social arrangement. The mask diverts the viewer's attention from what it hides and directs attention to what it advertises. So the mask's power lies in its ability to distract, to show that African Americans can be content, to show that African Americans can master the pinnacles of civic and social behaviors. They such as model citizenship, moral virtue, intellectual acumen. For pillar of cloud politics, these were performances. They weren't ends unto themselves. They weren't doing this simply to fit in, but they were performances. For example, Absalom Jones displayed a mastery of exemplary citizenship to become a pillar in the Philadelphia community. But behind the mask, he used his social and political capital to fortify the free black community against increasing white animosity in the early years of the 19th century. On the other hand, those figures who represent pillars of fire rejected the mask. They were unwilling to fit in the unjust social arrangements. In fact, their politics proceeded just the opposite. They were intent on showing how dissatisfied they were, so much so that they oftentimes in their biblical interpretations found themselves not only rejected, but ostracized, and in more than one case, they ended up assassinated, not fitting in, being out of place. The Mass then testifies to this way of dealing with alienation. So, although their politics differed, the various interpreters that I work with share one thing. Each took up the Exodus story to articulate a shared emancipatory hope. That is, the idea that we are reaching the promised land. They adapted their interpretive field, that is, their beliefs, their politics, their community's understanding, their self-understandings. They adapted their prevailing politics, both cloud and fire, to meet the challenges of the nation's changing political economy and the ever-changing forces of racialization. From the end of the slave regime to uplift in the 19th century to civil rights and black power in the 20th century, in each era, they took the Exodus story and re-understood, reinterpreted, re-signified its symbols with new meaning. And necessarily so, because the condition of black life had changed. Either way, it was always oriented toward freedom. So I begin this tradition with Absalom Jones. His famous Thanksgiving sermon was delivered January 1st, 1808. Philadelphia. Absalom Jones exemplifies rather the robust, sort of diverse political discourse that was active and operative in Philadelphia and in Boston to some degree. In 1808, he delivered his celebrated Thanksgiving sermon based on Exodus 3. He delivered it to a well-established African-American congregation in Philadelphia's African Episcopal Church. He deploys a pillar of cloud politics that balances his community's ecclesial commitments for justice and balanced his community's tenuous position amid a larger white Philadelphia community. And so when he takes the Exodus story, he takes up the question of enslavement, but he takes it up in a way that shows gratitude to the U.S. Congress for abolishing the slave trade in January of 1808. Now, when I say abolishing the slave trade, I mean that's the importation of enslaved persons from the continent of Africa, not slavery in the United States, all right? So he's excited about this, and he exhorts his followers to continue to show that his community and that the African-American community extended is worthy of the kind of special dispensation that they are receiving. It is to a large degree, Absalom Jones is well accepted by the larger Philadelphia community. He purchases a house next door to one of the chief justices of the Supreme Court. He becomes well established, and that becomes his mask, if you will. At every turn, he displays exemplary citizenship. Behind the mask, he is engaging in some of the more subversive and, to some degree, illegal efforts in emancipating African Americans from slavery. Just a few years later, David Walker writes a strident and fiery appeal to the colored citizens of the world. Now, David Walker is in Boston. I didn't put that up there. In the Beacon Hill district of Boston. David Walker is interested in displaying how unlike a cloud he can be. In fact, David Walker becomes a radical pillar of fire against this nightscape of tranquility in the North. David Walker writes this fiery appeal to the colored citizens of the world. He specifically calls out Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Native Virginia. Although the book has been by this time published about 50 years earlier, it's still the most popular book in the United States at that time. And you think about it, it's not that, it has more to do with the fact that there aren't a whole lot of books published, a whole lot of different books published. So, notes on Virginia, Jefferson attempts to show some kind of parity between the cultural institutions, the land, and the people of the United States and that of Europe. He does sort of a taxonomy, if you will, of land, land, plants, flora, fauna, people, so forth, institutions, laws. And as he goes through that, there's one place where he attempts to do some anthropology, racialized anthropology, where he describes people of African descent. And one of the more repugnant descriptions is a comparison with that of an orangutan. David Walker takes umbrage to Jefferson, and he decides that he's going to call Jefferson out in this appeal. He uses the Exodus story to ground his appeal not only in the biblical story, but also in biblical history. And he shows by the structure of the appeal and by its content that African Americans are not what Thomas Jefferson claims they are. In fact, he structures his appeal in articles as reminiscent of the Declaration of Independence, which he knows that Thomas Jefferson has written. He appeals to Greek and Roman classical literature as a way of demonstrating to Thomas Jefferson that the limits of his intellect are not bound by what Jefferson claims. And he compares the Egyptians to Southern planters in the South who hold people in slavery. And what he claims is that the Egyptians are far more humane than these Christians who live in the South. And he does that by using the story of Joseph just before the Exodus story. And he says, well, when Joseph, who was a foreigner, comes into their territory, Joseph gets the best pieces of land. Joseph rises to become vizier of Egypt. And when Joseph does this, he is not in any way judged by his origin. He is judged on his merit. And he asks, well, why can't Southern planters do the same thing? And if that's the case, it would seem to me that Christianity has not in any way reformed the Southern planters beyond the pagan Egyptians, which is sort of a shorthand to his conclusion. But the appeal has such a wide impact that Southern planters in the South write to the mayor of Boston to ask that he execute David Walker. David Walker, in 1830, as still a young man, David Walker ends up poisoned in his shop. He made clothing, and in his clothing shop, he ends up poisoned. And this is again the kind of difference between the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. In Reconstruction, if we turn to Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and we're running close on time, but biblical interpretation changes between 1865 and the Nadir. That's the end of the Civil War in Nadir. And it's represented by two prominent figures, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, whose epic poem, Moses, Story of the Nile, 900 and some lines, all on the book of Exodus, an incredible piece of literary work. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper is the first African-American woman of letters. She earned her entire living based on her speeches and her writings. And her poem shows optimism with the possibilities for black life. And certainly you can imagine, just as Reconstruction is in full swing, there is quite a bit of optimism. All African Americans need to do is to work to improve their lives. There seems that the South has been pacified by Northern federal troops, and racism seems to be at bay, and so African Americans now have to work on a new promised land. Promised land gets reinterpreted, not freedom anymore, but now it's uplift. And uplift becomes the new way of understanding the Exodus story. If we could, the Promised Land moves just a bit further. Frances Harper takes her pillar of cloud performance this way. She models Victorian womanhood. She is demure and eloquent and chaste in her style and presentation, and at the same time, she engages in behind the mask. She engages in the activities with William Steele and the Underground Railroad. Reverend John Jasper, the Sunday Move. 9 years later, so Frances Harper's in Baltimore. John Jasper is in the cradle of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia, and he writes a sermon based on Exodus 15, the Lord God is a man of war. And he wields that sermon as a way of demonstrating to the South that you lost, and it was God who fought the war. He wields the Bible and this sermon as a puzzle, as a way of demonstrating his own hermeneutical sophistication, but also as a way of taking the Bible and using it to rethink ways that his captors had used it to define him. He defines himself as one who is, if you will, an envoy of Yahweh who participates in the destruction of the Confederacy. In the Harlem Renaissance, the most prominent example is the work of Zora Neale Hurston, emblematic of the Harlem Renaissance's intellectual tradition. In 1939, she publishes her book, Moses, Man of the Mountain. It is the first novel-length treatment of the Exodus story. In the aftermath of the Great Depression, Hurston is suspicious of the black community's reliance upon divine activity to resolve social ills. She focuses her pillar of fire politics on questions of African American self-reliance and human agency, and offers an important critique for biblical interpretation. Hurston takes up the Exodus story and fills in the gaps and focuses instead, as you think about the story, it's really focused on men, right? It's focused on Moses, focused on Aaron, focused on Pharaoh. Hurston takes a story and rewrites it and focuses it on women. Focuses it on Moses' mother, focuses it on the princess, and focuses it on Miriam and Zipporah. And she uses it to critique African American male leadership in the Harlem Renaissance and leading up to the Civil Rights Movement. She also uses it to critique the ways that African Americans have taken up Moses as a figural leader, such that every generation is awaiting God to send a new Moses to lead the community one step closer to freedom. Zora Neale Hurston writes that we ought to look to the community itself, particularly the women in the community. And her book, Moses, Man of the Nile, in a sort of ironic way. I mean, there's a bit of sarcasm there in the title, but because the book really does focus in a powerful way on the work of women in freedom. For African American biblical interpretation, the Civil Rights Movement, both as an ideological trajectory and a chronological rubric. I take it up ideologically in that it moves from the Harlem Renaissance, this idea of focusing on a new Negro in the Harlem Renaissance, to this idea of focusing on reforming the society. And the marches, the boycotts, and the sit-ins characterize a type of black resistance oriented toward reforming the institutions that had denied access to African Americans. Much of the interpretive activity of the time appropriated biblical texts for the purpose of civil attainment. And within that frame, I focus on two in this tradition. Adam Clayton Powell, who was the U.S. congressional representative from Harlem, and he was, at the time, the pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church, the largest Protestant congregation in the country. And Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights leader from the South. Begin with Adam Clayton Powell's sermon, Stop Blaming Everyone Else, written in 1953. It was delivered at a critical juncture in his career and in the formation of black political identity. Powell takes on a sort of pillar of fire politics where he rails against a system openly without any reserve. His sermon, Stop Blaming Everyone Else, is emblematic of this politics. For example, in the sermon, Powell tells African Americans that McCarthyism is something that they should attend to. Does anybody remember McCarthyism? It's a cancer on our society. Well, in the African American community focused on civil rights, McCarthyism was on the back burner. But Powell talks about the ways that McCarthyism has become a cancer not only in the larger society, but particularly in the African American community. If you know the ways that McCarthy used the threat of the accusation of communism against any kind of integrated effort for change, right? So Powell tells African Americans to take responsibility for what's going on in the larger world, because if you want the privileges of citizenship, that's its civil rights, then you also have to take responsibility for what's going on in the country at large. And so Powell's sermon becomes this kind of clarion call. Martin Luther King Jr. writes 2 sermons based on the Exodus early in his career: Death of Evil Upon the Seashore and Birth of a New Nation. In both sermons, he takes up the Exodus to deploy a certain pillar of cloud politics. Martin Luther King Jr., on the one hand, would take seemingly defenseless African Americans and put them in front of police dogs, in front of billy clubs, in front of rabid racists, and invite them or exhort them to participate in performing what was probably the pinnacle of virtue for the society. They would engage in what? Pious acts like prayer and singing. They would look defenseless, and seemingly so. But when the television cameras came, the nation was embarrassed by the ways that it was treating a significant portion of the population, its African American citizens. And certainly internationally, the nation was embarrassed on the world stage. The pillar of cloud is the idea that it's the piety that changes hearts. What's behind the mask was what King was doing in terms of embarrassing the nation and in terms of working to compel, if you will, first Kennedy, then LBJ, by way of this kind of power politics to embarrass them and to force change in the society. His two sermons, Death of Evil Upon the Seashore, delivered in 1955 when he first gets to Dexter Avenue, and then Birth of a New Nation in 57, in many ways exemplify his transition into this pillar of cloud politics. And finally, the Reverend Albert Cleage in the Black Power movement. The Black Power movement is the ideological heir to the Civil Rights movement. Within that frame, the tradition interrogates the interpretive work of Reverend Albert Cleage Jr. in Detroit. He was a friend of Niebuhr and a disciple of Jean-Paul Sartre. He delivered a sermon in 1967, right around the time of the Detroit Rebellion. The sermon is entitled, "What Can We Give Our Youth?" And it interprets Exodus both as an exercise in radical race politics and an exercise in Albert Cleage's own pillar of fire politics. While most figures of the Black Power movement abandoned the black church for what they perceived to be its accommodationist orientation, Cleage constructed a theology and a politics that maximized the best insights of the Civil Rights movement and the Black Power movement, all while remaining grounded in the black church. So for Cleage, the question was not about leaving the black church as most radicals of his day did. For Cleage, the question was, how might the theology of the black church work with the kind of resistance in the Black Power movement in order to shape the way that we fight for freedom. So this the Black Power movement in some ways ends much of the use of Exodus in the tradition of African American struggles for freedom. I take up the 6 of these that we've gone through simply as a way of demonstrating that in addition to some of the other traditions in Exodus, particularly an American tradition that begins with the Puritans, African American traditions of interpretation have also taken up the same sources, the Bible, the founding documents, and in many ways work to carve out an authentic American identity, one that's oriented toward freedom, one that continues to be eternally open, that operates in ways, unlike John Hagee, but operates in ways that accept difference and change and evolve according to the changing political economy or the changing political and economic landscape. This tradition continues in many ways as new interpreters take up the tradition and rethink its symbols of bondage and freedom, its figures of like Pharaoh and the children of Israel and Moses, and find new ways to take up the book of Exodus, the old story, new ways to apply it to our ever-evolving African American and larger American identity. So with that, I think we are over time by a minute, and so I want to thank you and open up for questions. Yes, question.
Do you think today that black communities and black Jews treat the laws different from others when they ride up and tear down the cities and run businesses? Are they interpreting the law different than others interpret the law as they different interpretations of the Bible?
I don't think they're interpreting the laws any differently. I think they're expressing a certain frustration with the social and civil arrangements that have not afforded them the same opportunities as others. I do think that they would question whether or not, we talked about authorities early on, they question whether or not authorities interpret the laws differently when they apply them to African Americans or Latino Americans and so forth. And so I think they live in a space of disjuncture, if you will, a space of dissonance, where on the one hand, you see the laws, but it's applied differently to you than it is to others. You see the ways that the authorities take up the laws, and you see the ways that society offers opportunity differently. And so I think that there is the question for them is, how do we find a way to apply the laws not only equally in terms of sentencing, in terms of arrest or the enforcement of the laws, but how do we also find a way to distribute opportunity equally? I think that becomes the real question. So I don't think they're reading the laws differently. Other questions? Yes?
Would you say that progressive crowd is sort of analogous to the concept of generous orthodoxy?
The process of what, though?
The concept of generous orthodoxy?
And you know what? That is an interesting analogy. Say more about that.
Well, I listened to the Revisionist History podcast of Blackwell.
Yes.
I listened to the Revisionist History podcast of Malcolm Gladwell, and one of the podcasts dealt with a very conservative Mennonite minister in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, who was very revered, had a very long standing in the community, and his adult son came out and told him he was gay, and how he dealt with that with his faith and his community, and how that affected them as a family, and it changed for him his whole concept of how he viewed his faith and his religion, and that he didn't express anger. He was, of course, they were shunned from their community, and his pastorship was rescinded. But he didn't hold any anger. He understood why they did that and why they felt they needed to do that. But he just wrote a very simple, very heartfelt letter to his congregation about the choices he had made and why. And it's really a beautiful letter in the idea that maybe that's the harder thing to do than the pillar of fire, because it really demands true sacrifice.
I do think you're right. I think the pillar of cloud is, in many ways, the more difficult way to approach injustice, and certainly as the Mennonite pastor did. When you think about it, he decided to model the kinds of virtues that he and the congregation share, and in a way that, on the one hand, affirmed his love for his family, his son, and at the same time affirmed that everything that he probably taught, all of his ministry, was still true. And you're absolutely right. That is a much more difficult way to be in the world. Yeah.
My question is about the Black Lives Matter movement. Mm-hmm. And obviously the intent of it is to empower blacks. And it seems like, and this may be a wrong interpretation on my part, that instead it's getting the, I don't know if I want to say the white community or whatever, to be alienated against the blacks. Why do blacks' lives matter more than whites or Hispanics or anybody else's lives? So I'd like if you would comment on that.
Well, I would say this. I think that it's unfortunate that that some in the white community have interpreted the slogan that way. And it's kind of like if I said save the polar bears, it doesn't mean I don't like grizzly bears. It just means I want to save the polar bears, because polar bears are becoming extinct. I say Black Lives Matter. It doesn't mean that other lives don't matter. What it does mean is that I'm calling attention to a specific phenomenon. That is the killing of African Americans in many ways by law enforcement. And so it's I think that it's important to step back and to think about ways that this movement is doing a little bit more than empowering. I think what the movement intends is simply that the law take up African Americans in the same way it takes up everybody else. That if you have an encounter with a police officer who sees and this is almost sort of natural, even you see a white perpetrator, you may imagine that white perpetrator as someone you know. It may, in many ways, evoke a memory, evoke a sense of a son or a daughter or an uncle or something. And so you treat them a little bit differently, even unconsciously. You do. If you see an African American, you to some degree, it invokes a different set of feelings, so part of what the Black Lives Matter movement attempts to do is to put front and center the disparities in the treatment, and to ask that the community do some self-reflection and to think about how we can work together to ensure that the entire body politic is healthy, and that we treat others in ways that equal citizenship requires. This was, however, it's interesting that we're getting a lot of pushback in the Black Lives Matter movement, and there's a lot of concern about the pushback. When I speak to my mother, who marched in the civil rights movement, she tells me all the time that it was no different. That in the civil rights movement, that those who marched and those who protested were considered either communists or troublemakers, rabble-rousers, that they were miscreants, there's something wrong, that they were menaces to society. So change has always been hard in our society. And it's always been met with this kind of, this sense of resistance to opening the society to greater acceptance. So I'm a little less, I think you're right, that it has evoked that kind of response. I am a little less concerned about that because we've seen it before at every turn. We can go back to the 1920s with the suffrage movement. I mean, the idea that a woman would vote, really? It was, and if you go back and read the literature, and you talk, I mean, it's some of the same things that are being said about the Black Lives Matter. So I mean, every time our society does this, you know, we and until we, you know, till we reach a point where we are more open, you know, we go through these growing pains.
The gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender class, and they've talked about dealing with some of those same issues in terms of how they've been treated over time, and little by little, you know, they've been treated more like human beings rather than horrible outcasts. And, you know, again, going back to the Bible and the church, you know, their I don't know what the word is, abhorrence or something.
Yes, absolutely. No, thank you for that question. Thank you very much.